the motion which he has given notice.
Thank you, Lord Mayor. I move the motion stated in today's papers in my name and seconded by Councillor Baz. And for the sake of complete openness, I should say I have consulted with the Chief Financial Officer and I do not have any interests that need declaring. This is far from the first time that the issue of exempt accommodation has come up on the floor of this chamber, and I make no apology for bringing it up again. For all the talk, far too little has actually been done. And as a result, many of the communities we represent continue to suffer quite appallingly. Residents of exempt accommodation are let down badly, effectively denied the support they need, and millions of pounds of public money is wasted, or perhaps more accurately, transferred to the bank accounts of unscrupulous landlords and providers. This is nothing short of a scandalous failure of governance by central government, and it is one we need to keep shouting about until it is put right. Today, I'm going to focus more on that failure of governance than the actual, the way it actually works, which we've talked about many times. But just before I do, let's just reflect a little bit on the impact of this failure of governance. I recently spoke with someone who has many years' experience of supporting women who experience homelessness, custodial sentences and domestic violence in our city. She told me shocking stories of women who beg to go back to prison when faced with the exempt accommodation they are expected to stay in. Similarly, of a young woman sleeping outside Lidl in the wind and rain of December, offered a place who felt safer where she was. And you can understand why when you hear the stories of sexual abuse taking place in these homes, with some run by criminal gangs and their links with the drugs trade. And just as you wouldn't want to live in such a place, you also wouldn't want to live next door. And you would certainly expect that if you did, it would be properly regulated. The failure to put in this proper regulation is even more egregious because there's very little disagreement about what needs to be done. There is a remarkable cross-party consensus in this chamber on that. And what's more, the normal barrier against reforms in government, the Treasury, will actually gain by this being sorted out. I don't doubt that the exempt accommodation policy was well-meaning at its inception, but the way it has been exploited has been a disaster for Birmingham and several northern cities. So how should a well-governed country respond? Sure, take some time to understand the problem and the failure points, work out how to fix the system, and then generate proposals and legislate. It would be understandable if that process took a couple of years. But what has actually happened? Well, it started to become clear that there was a major problem towards the end of the 2010s. A scrutiny inquiry into exempt accommodation in this city reported in December 2021. And there was then a parliamentary select committee inquiry held in 2022, which called for urgent action. Then there is what you might think is a stroke of luck, with the chair of that select committee inquiry winning the private members' ballot and using it to bring in legislation to regulate the sector. This passed and received the royal assent in August 2023, stated that the government must set up a panel and bring in regulation within a year. So, a year to recruit the panel and consult on the nature of the regulation, perhaps rather slow you might think, but it's central government, and at least it gets the job done. But here we are, nearly 18 months later, and the government hasn't even started the consultation on the regulation, and the panel is still being recruited. Now, for sure, there's been a general election during that time, which might have delayed things for a couple of months, but no more than that, as this isn't a party political issue. The real horror for those desperate for action is to see how this might play out from now on. So at some point, hopefully soon, the consultation starts. That will take months, and then the government has to consider the results of it and draft the regulations itself. They need to be implemented, and who knows, there may be further legislation needed. And say it recommends a licensing system. Will we have to apply for it to come here? And how long will that take? And if approved, past experience suggests there may be a 12-month notice period. And then when it starts, the council has to recruit staff to run it. And you add all that up, and we're looking at years and years into the future before a working system is actually running on the ground. By this time, the horses haven't just bolted, they've bred a whole herd, causing more chaos in our communities. We need to shorten this process and bring in regulation that we can use this year. And it's even worse when it comes to planning. We're now looking at a 3-year consideration as to whether planning law should change. That's madness. Our residents are right when they refer to exempt properties as HMOs, and planning law is wrong when it classifies them as family homes. They are HMOs, and they should be classified as HMOs in planning law here and now, allowing us to use the tools that we have in limiting the concentration of HMOs to apply to exempt properties as well. One small step in the right direction was government SHIP funding. This is supported housing improvement programme that funds the exempt accommodation team to inspect properties. It's telling, of course, that the funding for this runs out this spring. That is when proper regulation should have been in place to take over from that scheme. Given that we are miles away from that happening, we clearly need for this to continue until it does, and our motion calls for this. The final part of our motion calls for the increasing complexity of the housing field and the problems this causes in working out what type of property is causing out a problem and then how we tackle it. And we need to address that, and we suggest doing that by bringing in a register of property types that we can get straight onto the right teams when we have a problem to find out what type of the property is and what needs to be done about it. So in conclusion, I return to the point about this being a failure of government. We can speculate why, but it's hard to escape one point, and that is how Birmingham regulates its housing should be a decision for Birmingham and not Westminster. If it were, I would have no doubt that we would have dealt with it by now. We are an over-centralised country, and this issue is a classic illustration of how it costs us. Lord Mayor, it's time for action. Indeed, it's well past time for action. I move the motion.
Thank you.